How do we understand the book of Job? To start with, let's ask 5 questions. Who, what, when, where, and why? Who wrote the book of Job? The answer to that is pretty simple. We don't know. We think that Job started as a folk tale passed from generation to generation by word of mouth. At some point, it was put into written form by what we call the wisdom writers. When was it written? We don't know that either. Job is one of the hardest Hebrew scriptures to try to date because there really aren't any clues to tell us when it was written or even what historical period it's set in. To tell the truth, it probably doesn't fit into any period of history at all. It looks like it's a sort of a parable, a made-up story designed to teach us something about God and humanity. What is Job? It started as a folk tale, a short story with a simple moral. However, it deals with some very deep and serious questions. So when the wisdom writers got a hold of it, they thought short and simple just isn't going to cut it. They expanded it considerably, adding in long philosophical speeches about the questions it raises. Where does Job happen? Surprisingly, for a biblical story, it does not take place in Israel, and the names of the characters are not Hebrew names. It takes place in the land of Uz. Nobody really knows where Uz is, or even if Uz was. Some speculate it may have been the country of Aram. Others say it was Edom. Still others suggest more distant places like Arabia or even Uzbekistan. Maybe Uz was somewhere over the rainbow. Not literally, of course, but like the wonderful land of Oz, the country of Uz may be a made-up place. Consider this. The word Uz literally means counsel or advice. What better name for a made-up country in a story about a man whose friends give him bad advice? Job is 42 chapters long and can be divided into 3 segments. There's the folk tale, which is the oldest version of the story. This is very short and occupies only the first 2 chapters and the last half of the last chapter. Next, there is the poetic section, which was added by the wisdom writers. As you can see, this is by far the longest section of the book. In fact, it's so long that we're going to stick to the folktale section in this video and make a second video to deal with that later. Finally, there are a couple of sections that appear to have been added by later writers. Job is a difficult book that raises a lot of questions, and it doesn't answer them to everyone's satisfaction. These later sections appear to be the work of other writers who decided to fix the book by bringing it back to a more traditional and simpler explanation. If we're going to understand Job, we have to start somewhere. So let's start with the folktale section. It begins by introducing us to Job, who is a wise, respected, and prosperous inhabitant of the land of Uz. He has a wife, 7 sons, and 3 daughters. He also has large flocks of sheep, herds of camels, herds of oxen, and herds of donkeys. The story then shifts to God, who is reigning in the heavenly court. Suddenly, Satan enters and begins to speak to God. Wait a minute. Satan? What's he doing in heaven? What business has he got speaking with God? When we hear the name Satan, it comes with all kinds of baggage. We think of him as the Lord of Lies, the Prince of Evil, the ruler of hell, the Lord of all demons, and the star of about a zillion horror movies. The thing is, he isn't any of those things in the book of Job. Most of what we think we know about Satan comes from medieval art and legend and from Hollywood. In the Hebrew scriptures, Satan is a very different character. He's not evil, he's not associated with demons, he's not associated with hell, and he isn't even God's enemy. In fact, Satan works for God. Satan isn't even his name. We aren't told what his name is, but Satan is a job title. The Hebrew phrase is ha-satan, which means the accuser or the adversary. He's kind of like a heavenly prosecuting attorney whose job is to find people who are only pretending to be righteous and accuse them before God. There's much more to be said about Satan in the Bible, but that will have to wait for another video. For now, just try to put aside any preconceptions you might have and think of him as God's accuser. When you see it that way, there's no surprise to see him in the heavenly court bringing a report to God. After all, that's his job. The accuser says he hasn't found any righteous people in the world. God says, what about Job? I'm really impressed with Job's wisdom and righteousness. The accuser says, well, of course he acts good. Why wouldn't he? You've incentivized him. Look at all the good things he has in his life. Wealth, respect, family, all the sheep and donkeys anyone could want. If you took all that away, would he still be righteous? God thinks about that and says, I don't know. Maybe we should find out. So the accuser goes to work. First, the Sabaeans came and stole all of Job's oxen and donkeys, killing many of his herders in the process. Second, fire fell from heaven, killing all of Job's sheep and quite a few shepherds. Third, Chaldean raiders came and took all of Job's camels. Finally, Job's sons and daughters were in his house celebrating when a terrible windstorm caused the roof to fall in, killing all of them. This was a series of events that would have shattered anyone. But somehow, through it all, Job managed to maintain his faith. He continued to be a righteous man in God's eyes, even in the face of these catastrophic losses. And so when God and the accuser met again, God said, I told you so. But the adversary still wasn't convinced. He said, look, Job still has his health. He can rebuild his life. Let me take that away, and then we'll see how righteous he is. So God agreed, and Job developed a series of boils that cropped up all over his body. At this point, he was as thoroughly miserable as he could possibly be. He sat in a pile of ashes, poking at his sores with a potsherd and feeling horrible. Fortunately, Job had friends, and 3 of those friends, some guys named Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, came to help him. At first, they didn't say anything. They just sat with him and shared his grief. If you've ever gone through a really rough time, you will probably understand how much that can mean. There are few things that are more powerful than a friend who is willing to silently sit with you through the worst parts of your life. It's something you can call a ministry of presence, and it can be much more comforting and much more beneficial than someone who tries to fix your problems for you. Unfortunately, the desire to fix things is very strong in people. After several days, the friends opened their mouths and tried to explain to Job how his problems were all his own fault. It didn't go very well. However, since that part of the story really belongs to the poetic section, we're going to put off those until part 2. As far as the folktale concerns, the only important thing is that Job kept his faith even when his friends turned on him. On seeing how faithful Job had been, God realized that his righteousness was genuine and not just because of the good things he had received. Knowing this, God gave back to Job his health, his sheep, his camels, his oxen, his donkeys, his respect in the community, and even his children. Well, technically they were a whole new batch of children, but that was okay because the new children were better than the old ones. There are definitely some issues in Job, and we will look at them in more depth in part 2. For now, let's take a look at the moral of the folktale section. Does it tell us why there is suffering? Some would say yes, that the folk tale of Job explains exactly why there is suffering, and there are two commonly used explanations. The first is that suffering is the fault of Satan. The idea is that God is a force of pure good in the world, and that every good thing that happens is a result of God's actions. Satan is the force of pure evil, and is constantly fighting against God to make bad things happen. When anything happens to us, it must be Satan's fault. This is a popular understanding, mostly because it is simple, easy to understand. However, it creates problems. If God is all-powerful, how can Satan ever succeed in causing bad things to happen, even little bad things? For this to work, the devil would have to be close to God in power, close enough to make it a decent fight. And that does not fit with the understanding of God in the Abrahamic faiths. God is considered supremely powerful. It also doesn't work in the book of Job, because that's just not who the accuser is. In Job, the accuser is not evil. He does some pretty nasty things to Job, but these are all with the approval of God. The accuser works for God, and ultimately, everything that happens to Job is God's responsibility. The second idea is that if bad things happen to us, God must be testing our faith. That fits the folktale pretty well, but we have to wonder, if God is all-knowing, why is it necessary to test us? Shouldn't God be able to judge our hearts without putting us through such terrible experiences? It's hard to read the folktale sections of Job without coming to the conclusion that God is a real jerk. When a human being has to make someone suffer to prove their devotion, that's manipulative, that's abusive. We'd advise anyone to get out of that relationship. When that person doesn't care about the collateral damage their testing causes, it makes them even worse. Even if Job's suffering was somehow justified, what about all of his servants who were killed, the shepherds and the cattle tenders and the rest? What about Job's 7 sons and 3 daughters? Why should they have to die just to make a point about their father's righteousness? The fact that Job eventually gets new sons and daughters doesn't begin to make up for this loss. And the fact that the story suggests it does makes God seem even more callous. For these reasons, I don't think the idea that God is testing you is a good answer, not for anyone who has experienced God as loving and compassionate. But I think I know why this happens in the Job folktale. There's a thing that writers do sometimes called an out-of-character moment. That's when a character you've gotten to know suddenly does something so different than your expectations that it shocks and upsets you. No, Luke, don't throw the lightsaber away. Anyway, when this happens, it means one of two things. Either the writer is giving us a new insight to the character which can lead to greater depth, or the writer is looking for cheap drama and is willing to throw away established character development to make the story go where they want it to. I think that's what's happening in Job. The folktale wants to show us how the perfectly virtuous person deals with unjust suffering. And the easy way to do that is to make God act like a... I don't think it was a good move. And neither did the wisdom writers, which is why they added 32 chapters to the book. So if Job fails to answer the question of why good people suffer, what is the point? Oddly, I think the message is something even the wisdom writers would agree with. Even in the worst times, keep faith in God. That simple message remains consistent through all the iterations of Job, although that does leave us with a lot of other questions to grapple with. For more on that, please join me for part 2. In the meantime, if you like this content, please hit the like button and the subscribe button and come back often. And then there's the question of the reward. Was Job every bit as happy with his new children? Was he more happy? That doesn't seem like a very relatable response. We love our children, and no substitute will ever take their place. And then what of all the people who struggle and suffer and remain faithful, but never see a reward in this life? It's a hard answer to. And then there's the question of the reward. Was Job every bit as happy with his new children? Was he more happy? That doesn't seem like a very relatable response. We love our children, and no substitute will ever take their place. And then what of all the people who struggle and suffer and remain faithful, but never see a reward in this life? It's a hard answer to. If this doesn't seem like a satisfactory ending to you, well, it wasn't a satisfactory ending for the wisdom writers either. And next time, we're going to take a look at all the questions they asked and all the answers that might come from those questions. Until then, if you like this content, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and come back and join us for more.